The rain had already begun by the time I left my flat, not the kind that announces itself in violent sheets against the glass, but the softer, more persistent drizzle that seeps into stone and skin alike. Oxford wears such weather like an old garment. The cloisters grow darker, the gutters whisper, and the pavements glisten with a kind of weary dignity. I pulled the collar of my coat a little higher, though it never did much to keep the damp from settling. It is strange how one remembers the smell before anything else. Wet leaves, damp limestone, and the faint tang of ink and paper carried out through the open doors of the Bodleian. Even the pubs, half-lit and already gathering their regulars, smelt of wood swollen by centuries of rain. One might think the whole city is a cathedral devoted not to faith, but to water and silence. That evening I had no pressing summons, no urgent crime laid at my feet. Only a letter, unsigned, slipped beneath my door earlier that day. The handwriting was cramped, almost apologetic, the sort one associates with a nervous scholar or a parish clerk. It said very little about death at Exeter. Not natural, you should see, nothing more, no signature, no return, just those words, as flat and unyielding as the rain on the stones. I told myself I might ignore it. I had every right to. Yet I found my steps carrying me in that direction, as if curiosity had already made its home in my chest and would not be shifted. By the time I reached the college gates, the drizzle had thickened into something nearer to rain, and I paused beneath the arch, listening to the echo of water dripping onto ancient flagstones. The porter looked up from his crossword when I entered, his pen frozen in mid-air. He greeted me with the kind of recognition reserved for those who appear too often in the lives of ordinary men. He asked whether I was here on business or pleasure. I answered that in Oxford the two were rarely distinct. His eyes dropped briefly to the half-finished crossword. I noticed 17 down remained unsolved. A simple clue ecclesiastical garment, 4 letters. He had written A and C, I murmured Alb, and he nodded, half grateful, half resentful, as though deduction were a trick played at his expense. He said nothing of the letter, nor did I ask. Instead, he motioned vaguely towards the quadrangle, where the rain gathered in small, untroubled pools. Exeter always seemed to me a place of half-secret staircases that turned abruptly, doors that concealed more silence than space, and libraries that swallowed men whole. I found myself drawn not to the chapel or the hall, but to a narrow corridor leading to the fellows' rooms. The floorboards beneath my shoes groaned in complaint, a familiar chorus. A light shone dimly at the far end, and with it the faint murmur of voices. I caught only fragments of a phrase here, a hesitation there. Enough to know that someone within was attempting discretion and failing. It is in such moments that one notices the smallest things. A wet umbrella leaning against the wall, though the man inside had removed his coat. A pair of shoes, scuffed by long walks, set neatly side by side. A forgotten note pinned to the door dinner moved to 7. Little details, trifling to most, but in their disorder they whispered that something had been disrupted, some rhythm broken. When at last I entered, the room was filled not with scandal or revelation, but with silence. A single chair stood near the fire, empty, though its cushion still bore the slight indentation of use. On the mantel lay a glass, half drunk, the whisky watered down by neglect. And on the desk an open book, face down as though its reader had been called away mid-sentence. It is a peculiar thing how absence announces itself more clearly than presence. The rain beat harder against the window, and I could almost hear it marking time. Somewhere beyond these walls a man was dead, and someone had thought I should know. I lingered, listening to the rain, to the creak of the corridor outside, to the faint and stubborn heartbeat of the city itself. Oxford never gives up her secrets quickly, but then neither do I. Magdalene has always carried a certain theatricality about it, a kind of pageantry that other colleges only approximate. The tower rising against the sky, the deer park with its quiet and deliberate creatures, the long cloisters that seem designed for whispers. One does not walk through Magdalene, one passes through it as though entering a stage where silence has already rehearsed its lines. On that evening, the rain had given way to mist, and the lamps along the High were haloed in their own reflections. Oxford looked less like a city than a half-forgotten dream, reluctant to wake. I had been called not by letter this time, but by a voice, hesitant and almost ashamed, that had found me at the Randolph bar. The young fellow wore the look of a man too aware of how out of place he was among whiskey glasses and wood panelling. He asked if I would come. "Someone has gone missing," he said, and though Magdalene's officials had spoken of delay, of waiting for the natural course of events, there was an undertone that told me he feared something worse. Missing is only the polite word, isn't it, when absence becomes inconvenient? I walked with him down the High, his words tumbling out in fragments like loose coins scattered on stone. A student, not much more than 20, promising, always promising, they said, good at rowing, though not exceptional, an ear for poetry, though not published, the kind of man people remembered only in fragments, but who left a gap when gone, as though the room had been measured and found itself suddenly out of proportion. His name was Oliver Finch. It meant nothing to me then, though later I would come to know the sound of it too well. When we entered the porter's lodge, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the faint bitterness of old tea. The porter, a broad man with a face carved into patience, looked at me as though I were both expected and unwelcome. He told me that young men disappear often, sometimes for a night, sometimes for a week. Women, whiskey, wages, the three familiar W's he called them. But there was little conviction in his tone. I noticed the crossword again, unfinished on his desk. 12 across inquisitive, 7 letters he had written. No, I supplied Snoopy and received only a grunt in return. A small thing, perhaps, but the absence of gratitude revealed the depth of his unease. We walked through the cloisters, the sound of our shoes echoing off the damp stone. It is strange how footsteps in such places always sound like more than two, as if the dead walk beside us. My companion told me that Finch had last been seen leaving Hall after dinner. He had risen quietly, too quietly, as if not wishing to be noticed. A coat over his arm, though it was still raining outside. One of the fellows had remarked on it. Why carry the coat when one might wear it? I stored that detail away. Too small to matter, perhaps. But it remained lodged, like grit in the mind. We searched his rooms, sparse but not untidy. Books on the desk, not in piles, but aligned in careful symmetry. A book of verse, face down, as though interrupted mid-line. I felt the echo of Exeter in that gesture, the same unfinished sentence. His wardrobe held little distinction. A few shirts, a single suit, shoes polished to a dull shine. What drew my attention was a small slip of paper, torn at one edge, half hidden beneath an inkwell. 4 words, written in an unsteady hand, "The bridge at dawn," no explanation, no signature. I showed it to my companion, who shook his head in ignorance. Yet the words themselves carried their own weight. Why at dawn? Why the bridge? And why write it at all if one intended to go without witness? Later, I stood by the window, looking out into the quadrangle where the mist had thickened. Figures passed occasionally, indistinct, like memories unwilling to form. One paused, glanced up, and then moved on. The kind of glance that carries more knowledge than it intends. When I asked who lived in the rooms opposite, my companion told me a fellow-in-law, sharp, ambitious, fond of winning arguments for their own sake. I nodded, though I did not yet know why that mattered. Sometimes one senses only the shape of relevance, not its meaning. It was near midnight when I found myself by the bridge. Magdalene's bridge is no grand structure, merely a span over slow water, but in the fog it seemed longer, more deliberate, as though it connected not banks, but worlds. I leaned upon the stone, listening to the water's patient current. The mist carried voices, faint and indistinct, but when I turned, there was no one, only the outline of trees, the hush of deer moving silently, the faint glimmer of a cigarette dropped and forgotten. I crushed it beneath my heel, wondering who had stood there before. Me, and how long ago. A constable found me and asked what I sought. I told him nothing certain, only the shape of a question. He asked if I suspected foul play. I answered that Oxford never plays fair. He looked at me strangely, as men often do when I speak what I believe to be plain. He told me they had dragged the river earlier, though not thoroughly. It was too soon, he said, to think the worst. Too soon, I thought, or too late? Back in Finch's room, I searched once more. It is always the second glance that reveals what the first ignores. On his desk lay a half-completed crossword, perhaps the same paper the porter had been working from. Finch had written 9 down opposite of loss, 3 letters. He had begun with G gain, but he had crossed it out, replaced it with win. The choice struck me, not loss but win, not balance, but victory. It suggested a mind preoccupied with contests, not with absolutes. Did that matter? Perhaps not. But in the quiet hours of the night, such fragments assemble themselves into patterns, whether true or false. I left Magdalene as the first light of morning began to blur the horizon. The mist had not lifted, only thinned. The stones beneath my feet were slick, reflecting the half-light. I carried the slip of paper in my pocket. The bridge at dawn felt its weight as though it were a verdict. Somewhere, Oliver Finch had stepped out of one world and into another. Whether by choice or compulsion, I did not yet know. But the silence of Magdalene pressed against me like a hand upon the shoulder, urging me to listen more closely. I walked back towards the city, my coat heavy with damp, my mind heavier still. The pubs were not yet open, and the bells had not yet begun their morning declarations. Only the sound of my steps accompanied me, and I wondered not for the first time whether the dead listen to the living, or whether they keep their silence as jealously as the stones keep their rain. The quad had always been to my mind a stage. By daylight it performed one kind of play tourists wandering under umbrellas, students hurrying in robes, dons pretending not to see one another. But by night, with the mist settling low and the lamps throwing their pale halos on the damp grass, the same space became something altogether different. An echo chamber of secrets. The rain had passed, leaving behind a sheen upon the flagstones, as though the college itself had been polished for scrutiny. I returned to Magdalene with a growing sense that Finch's disappearance, however ordinary the explanations offered, was not ordinary at all. The note, "The bridge at dawn," lay folded in my pocket. I had turned the words over until they had almost ceased to mean anything, and yet I knew they mattered. Such deliberate brevity does not come from a young man planning only mischief. It comes from a mind that wants to be understood, but not by all. In the porter's lodge the crossword had advanced. 17 down the clue I had supplied the previous night was now neatly inked, and a new puzzle had begun. For a crossbird of omen, 3 letters. The porter had left it blank, but I filled it silently in my mind. Owl, a trivial detail, but one that seemed to perch over the whole business. I asked him who had eaten in Hall on the night Finch was last seen. He recited the list with professional precision, though not without reluctance. Names I scarcely knew, but patterns began to emerge. A fellow of law, sharp-tongued and ambitious. a mathematician with the distracted air of one who thinks of numbers while drinking soup, a historian, older, quieter, who had made his career on small discoveries of greater importance than they seemed. Students too, 2 rowers, a pair of sisters from Somerville visiting as guests, and Finch himself. The company of an evening reduced to a roster of absences and presences. I took myself into the quad where the grass was still damp from the morning dew. A handful of figures lingered there, students unwilling to retire, their voices low, their gestures quick. I lingered at the edge, a ghost in my own city, and listened. One spoke of Finch as if he were already gone, his tone carrying the faint thrill of drama. Another dismissed the matter entirely, insisting that Finch had eloped to London for some tryst. A third, quieter, said nothing at all, but his silence weighed more than their chatter. He stared at the ground as though the stones themselves were speaking. It was to him I drifted, and when at last we spoke, it was not of Finch, but of rain. He said the sound of it against the windows kept him awake. I asked whether Finch had often spoken of sleeplessness. The young man hesitated, then admitted he had. He said Finch walked the quad at night, circling it like a man rehearsing something. Words, perhaps, or choices, that was all. Yet it told me more than he realized. A man rehearses only when he fears forgetting or when he prepares to act. Later I spoke with the law fellow in his room overlooking the quad. He received me with the careful politeness of one trained to measure every syllable. He said Finch was unreliable, prone to dramatics, and far too concerned with appearances. He said the college should not be alarmed. And yet his hand betrayed him, restless against the arm of his chair, tapping out a rhythm as though cross-examining himself. A gesture unfit for a man so proud of control. I left him with his rhythm and his arguments, neither of which convinced me. The mathematician was harder still. His room smelled faintly of chalk dust, though no blackboard was present. He muttered of probability, of likelihood, of the statistical certainty that Finch would reappear. But when I asked what he remembered of the dinner, he faltered. He recalled the soup was thin, the wine poor, the candles smoky. But Finch? He said Finch was present, and then he said Finch might have been absent. I realized he did not know the difference between memory and presumption. Numbers, yes. Faces, no. It was the historian who caught me most. His room was lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of centuries. He listened to my questions with patience, answering little, but offering fragments of observation that carried the weight of something more. He said Finch had spoken that evening of bridges, of water, of time passing more quickly than one thinks. A curious subject for Hall. He said Finch had raised a glass, but never drank from it. He said quietly that some men walk among us already halfway to their absence. Crossword clues, I thought again. Bird of omen, owl, a creature that sees in darkness, silent in its flight, patient in its hunger, a symbol of knowledge, but also of endings. It seemed to hover over Finch, unseen but present. I returned to the quad and stood in its centre. The lamps hissed faintly, their halos trembling in the mist. I imagined Finch walking here, circling the grass in restless loops, rehearsing his departure. Around him the college walls rise like the edges of a stage, each window an audience, each shadow a witness. And then he was gone, vanished as if the stones had absorbed him. I do not believe in vanishing acts. I believe in gestures overlooked, in words half heard, in objects misplaced. I believe that Finch left traces, not in the obvious places, but in the quiet ones. A slip of paper, a forgotten glance, a coat carried instead of worn. Each clue is a note in a melody too soft to hear at first. I left Magdalene again that night with more suspects than answers. The law fellow with his restless hand, the mathematician with his unreliable memory, the historian with his patience, the students with their chatter, and the one with his silence, each a fragment of a puzzle that had not yet revealed its pattern. The quad was silent now, emptied of voices, but the stones retained them. Oxford remembers even when men choose to forget. As I crossed the bridge once more, the mist thickened and the river below whispered its slow song. I paused, leaning upon the stone, listening. Somewhere in that silence, Finch's absence was speaking. I could not yet translate its language, but I knew it would not remain hidden forever. And so I walked on, the note in my pocket like a weight, the word dawn echoing as though the city itself had whispered it in my ear. The library at Magdalene had always seemed to me less a place of study than of confinement. The long, narrow aisles hemmed in by shelves, the air perfumed with centuries of dust and vellum, the faint, resigned creak of ladders when moved. It was not learning that dominated there, but silence, oppressive, vigilant, a silence that listened. I entered in the late afternoon, when the mist still clung to the lawns outside, and the lamps within gave off a dull, amber glow that turned every shadow into a footnote. The librarian greeted me with the weary civility of a man used to fielding more requests than his hours could accommodate. He said little, but I caught the faint quiver of irritation in his hands as he replaced a volume on its shelf. He disliked disruption, and Finch's disappearance had sent ripples through the still water of his domain. He said students had been whispering more than usual, books returned late, a general restlessness. He added that Finch had been here the day before he vanished. Not unusual. He was a frequent visitor, but that time he had taken nothing out. He had sat at one of the long oak tables, a book open before him, and then, after some minutes, left abruptly. No one had seen what book it was. The librarian had been shelving volumes in the next aisle and glimpsed only the back of Finch's head, bent low, shoulders tense. I walked the aisles slowly, trailing my fingers along the worn spines, Latin texts, histories, sermons, all arranged with the meticulous devotion that Oxford demands of its custodians. A faint mark in the dust caught my attention, a square of slightly cleaner wood where a volume had been recently removed and not replaced. The gap was already filled, but not neatly. My eyes narrowed. A small deduction, but enough the book Finch had taken was replaced by another hand, and carelessly. I pulled the volume free. It was a slim collection of verse, unremarkable except for a faint pencil line under one stanza. I read it slowly, aloud in my mind, and bridges cross what water hides, though no man knows what shore divides. The line was underlined twice. I felt the echo of that slip of paper, the bridge at dawn now sharpened by the hand of poetry. Finch, or someone near him, had found resonance in those words. Why else underline them? Why else choose that book, that stanza? At the far end of the library, a cough broke the silence. I turned and saw the historian, the same who had spoken of Finch with such patience in his rooms. He sat with a pile of books before him, spectacles balanced precariously, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He said he often worked here until dusk, that the silence suited him. He said Finch had spoken to him once in this very room, asking whether history ever truly records the truth, or whether it merely records the persistence of lies. The historian had replied, he told me, that all history is a kind of disappearance, some louder than others. It was a clever remark, too clever, perhaps rehearsed. I watched his hands as he spoke. They lingered too long on the page, caressed the edge of a book as though to conceal a tremor. He was hiding something, not necessarily guilt, but knowledge. He said he had not spoken to Finch on the night he vanished, but his pause before the denial was just a breath too long. Sometimes it is the hesitation, not the statement, that reveals the truth. I asked him idly about crosswords. He smiled, said he preferred acrostics. Yet his eyes flickered when I offered him a clue. 5 down echo, 4 letters, he murmured, once after a moment's hesitation. A curious answer, correct in its way. An echo is a sound repeated, once heard again, but not the common solution. He had revealed something of his mind, an inclination to see meaning where others saw only the surface. A man like Finch might have found that attractive, dangerous even. As I moved away, I noticed a scrap of paper tucked under one of the heavy lecterns. Torn from the margin of a notebook, it bore a single word, witness, nothing more. It might have been a student's careless jotting, or it might have been Finch's. The word seemed to linger in the air, as though waiting to be spoken aloud in the wrong company. I left the library as dusk descended, the sky above the quad bruised with gathering dark. The lamps had been lit, and their reflections glimmered faintly on the slick stones. I paused beneath the archway, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the deer park, the echo of distant voices. The library behind me seemed to hold its breath, guarding whatever secrets Finch had disturbed. What is a library, after all, but an echo chamber of vanished voices, the dead whisper from their pages, and the living, if they listen closely enough, may hear more than they wished. Finch had listened, too well perhaps? I walked back across the quad, the note still heavy in my pocket, the stanza repeating in my mind and bridges crossing what water hides. It was not a clue solved, only a clue deepened, an echo of an echo. I knew then that Finch's disappearance was no random act, no youthful folly. It was a deliberate crossing, a movement from one shore to another. Which shore he had chosen or been forced towards, I could not yet say. The bells of Magdalene Tower began to toll the hour, their sound rolling across the mist like a slow lament. Each peal seemed to ask the same question, one I could not yet answer. Who had witnessed Finch at the bridge, and who had ensured he did not return? It was the river that pulled me back, though I cannot say whether it was logic or something more elusive that guided my steps that evening. The Thames, or the Isis, as Oxford insists upon naming it, had grown swollen from days of rain, its surface restless, dark, and vaguely accusatory. By day it reflected the city's facades, by night it devoured them. The lamps along the bank gave off no more than small pools of light, leaving the rest to shadow. One could easily disappear there, not just from sight, but from memory. I had been told of a woman who walked by the river after dusk, not a student, not a fellow, but someone from the outside, drawn in by ties less official. Some said she was a widow from Iffley, others that she kept a room in Cowley. Her identity seemed as mutable as the water itself. What mattered was that she had been seen in conversation with Finch days before his absence. The river, then, might still carry her trace. I found her leaning against the rail, looking out across the black water as though it spoke to her. She did not start when I approached. She said quietly that the mist made the river larger, that it seemed to stretch into places unnamed. I told her I was looking into Finch. Her silence lengthened, then broke into words no louder than the flow itself. She said he had come here often, restless, carrying questions that pressed too heavily to be kept within college walls. He asked her whether people vanish because they choose to, or because someone chooses for them. She did not know how to answer. I studied her face under the uncertain light. Lines of weariness, yes, but also the sharpness of one accustomed to watching. Her hands rested on the railing, pale and still, though the river wind cut at them. A small silver brooch glimmered at her collar, shaped like a key. I found myself noting it without knowing why. She caught my glance and turned the brooch slightly inward, as though to conceal it. An instinctive gesture, defensive. In that concealment was an admission she had more to say than she dared. She spoke then of the bridge. Finch had mentioned it to her, not in the language of romance, but of inevitability. He said dawn was the only honest hour when disguises fail, when the city looks unpainted. She had asked him why the bridge, and he had replied only that water remembers what men forget. I asked her if he feared someone. She shook her head slowly, but her eyes shifted towards the darkened towpath where shadows deepened. Fear, in Oxford, rarely declares itself aloud. I pressed further. Had she seen him on the night he vanished? A pause, and then the faintest nod. She had stood on this very spot, seen him approach the bridge, coat over his arm, though the night was chill. He was not alone, she said. A figure followed at a distance. She could not be sure of the face mist obscures as much as it reveals, but she thought it was someone older, slower in step, deliberate. When I asked if she had told the police, she looked away. "They would not believe me," she murmured. "They do not believe women who appear from the margins." Her words lingered with me as heavily as the mist, from the margins. Finch himself had been circling the margins of college, of youth, of something unnamed. And now here was a woman similarly displaced, her knowledge doubted, her presence unofficial. In their connection lay a pattern, faint but insistent. I offered her a crossword clue almost carelessly. 8 across lock opener, 3 letters. She looked puzzled at first, then smiled faintly. "Key?" she said. Her hand touched the brooch without thinking. A trifling moment, but telling. Symbols surface where one least expects them. I wondered if Finch had noticed that same brooch, if he had read in it the promise of entry or of escape. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the river. The mist curled low, swallowing the arches of the bridge. A boat moved slowly upstream, its oars dipping without sound. The woman said she feared the water because it kept secrets too. Well, she said men believed they could bury what they wished in it, but the river always kept its own ledger. I asked her if Finch had trusted her. She said he had told her something once, a fragment she could not quite pass. He said, "The dead are not the only ones who vanish." I left her by the river, her figure dissolving into the fog, and walked towards the bridge. The stones glistened, slick and ancient, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of passage. I ran my hand along the parapet and felt a small notch cut into the stone, a mark unnoticed by most. Initials carved faintly, OF. Not recent, not deep, but there. I wondered whether Finch himself had marked it, a small, private declaration of presence in a world that already felt transient. As I turned to leave, I noticed something at the edge of the bank, caught in the reeds. A scrap of paper, blurred by damp, but still legible in part. The ink had run, yet one phrase persisted. Tell her, nothing more. Who she might be I could not yet know. The woman by the river, someone else, hidden still. Ambiguity again, as persistent as the mist. I carried the fragment with me back towards the city. Behind me the woman had vanished into the night, as if she belonged more to the river than to the streets. Ahead, the bells began to toll the hour, their notes heavy with rain. Oxford never surrendered its truths easily. It yielded them like reluctant witnesses, word by word, echo by echo. In my pocket I carried both the slip of paper and the memory of her brooch, shaped like a key. Between them, some meaning flickered, half-formed, like a light seen through fog. Finch had not walked alone into absence. He had left behind signs, witnesses, gestures, and the river, for all its secrecy, was whispering still. The telephone in my flat had rung earlier that day with a peculiar insistence, as if the bell itself carried meaning. Calls rarely arrived unannounced. When they did, they seldom brought clarity. The voice on the other end was cautious, modulated by distance, and gave only one instruction, Magdalene, again, after dusk. The word again hung in the air long after the line had gone dead. I found myself in the cloisters once more, where the sound of my shoes seemed amplified, echoing back at me like a second presence. The rain had returned, soft but steady, and the lamps glowed faintly in their cages of mist. Oxford at night gives the impression of listening in, as though the stones themselves weigh each syllable uttered within their reach. It was there, under that listening silence, that I began to notice the first tangle of crossed wires, not merely telephonic, but human. The law fellow intercepted me near the porter's lodge. He said Finch was a dreamer, unfit for serious study, his head in poetry when it should have been in statutes. He claimed to have no dealings with him beyond casual hall conversation. Yet his voice betrayed more than words aloud. There was a faint tightening at the corners, as if resentment had been stored away too long. When I asked whether he had been in hall that night, he confirmed it readily. Too readily. Men who tell the truth often stumble, men who lie rehearse. His answer bore rehearsal. The mathematician I found in his rooms bent over a sheaf of papers scored with symbols. He said Finch had always been distracted but harmless. When pressed, he admitted he had spoken with him once about probability. Finch had asked whether disappearance could be calculated, whether one could assign odds to absence. The mathematician had laughed it off, but he looked uneasy, as he told me so. He fiddled with his pencil, rolling it between his fingers as though to avoid my eyes. In the margin of his notes I glimpsed a single word scrawled repeatedly, proof. He was a man consumed by certainty and irritated by anything that resisted it. Finch, in his ambiguity, must have troubled him deeply. It was the historian who unsettled me most. He spoke of Finch with warmth, almost affection, but in tones too carefully arranged. He said Finch was fascinated by the way history forgets more than it remembers. He said he once caught Finch in the library copying out passages, not for research, but for himself, as though building a private archive of echoes. The historian smiled faintly as he said this, but his hands betrayed him. They drummed upon the desk in restless rhythm, much like the law fellow's tapping, crossed wires indeed, different men, same gestures, a rhythm of concealment running through them like a common current. Later, in the quad, I overheard two students whispering near the gate. Their words were hurried, half swallowed by the rain, but I caught enough bridge, dawn, witness. They fell silent when I passed, their faces drawn taut with that peculiar guilt of those who know too little but pretend too much. I asked what they were studying. One muttered physics, the other philosophy. Yet their books were unopened, their hands trembling. The nerves of youth, perhaps, or the tremors of complicity. In the porter's lodge the crossword lay open again. This time the clue was 7 down confusion, 5 letters. The porter had written chaos, correct, though in his scrawl the letters nearly tangled into one another. He asked if I thought Finch would be found. I replied only that absence is never neutral. He looked away, perhaps regretting the question. His crossword remained unfinished. Back in my room, I poured a measure of whiskey and studied the fragments I had gathered, the note, the stanza of verse, the underlined line, the scrap by the river. Each seemed disconnected, wires trailing in different directions, and yet when touched together, they sparked faintly. The bridge at dawn, tell her. The river remembers, proof. Each a current, faint but live, converging somewhere unseen. I recalled then something the woman by the river had said, that Finch wondered if people vanish by choice or by design. Choice or design, chaos or order. It struck me that these words mirrored the crossword clue. Confusion, chaos, but what if Finch had not been confused? What if his disappearance was neither accident nor whim, but arrangement? To design a vanishing requires an accomplice, or at least an audience. And in Oxford, audiences are never lacking. As midnight approached, I found myself listening to the wires again, not the ones overhead, strung across the city, but the invisible kind, stretched between people. Every man I had spoken with pulled at one end, denying the connection, while their gestures, hesitations, and half-silences tugged from the other. Crossed wires, knotted, sparking faintly in the dark. I thought again of the telephone call. A voice too cautious, too practiced. A man accustomed to argument, or a man accustomed to secrets. Could it have been the law fellow, eager to steer me, or the historian, too careful with his affections, or someone else entirely, listening from the margins, feeding me just enough to keep me in play? The whiskey warmed me, but did not settle me. I stared at the crossword the porter had abandoned in my memory. Confusion, chaos, letters cross, wires cross, lives cross. And somewhere within that confusion Finch had walked out of one world and into another, leaving behind a trail of sparks I could not yet arrange into light. When I finally extinguished the lamp, the silence of the room seemed alive, humming faintly, as though unseen wires stretched across the dark, carrying messages I could not quite decipher. High table at Magdalene has always seemed to me less a matter of nourishment than of theatre. The rituals are rehearsed until they pass for instinct, the slow procession in, the murmured Latin grace, the deliberate settling of gowns against wood, polished by centuries of weight. Even the food is staged, arriving with a flourish that distracts from its mediocrity. One dines not to eat, but to belong, and in belonging, to be measured. That evening I sat as an interloper, permitted by circumstance rather than invitation, and every eye seemed to weigh my presence like an unbalanced scale. The candles cast their unsteady light against the portraits, where long-dead benefactors stared down with the suspicion of men who donated gold but withheld trust. The clink of glassware, the scrape of knives, the sigh of chairs shifting, all of it rose together into a murmur that resembled conversation without quite achieving it. Oxford talk, I have always thought, is less about communication than concealment. The law fellow was there, of course, his features arranged into an expression of weary superiority. He spoke loudly of statutes and precedents, his voice carrying across the table as if seeking an audience wider than those present. He dismissed Finch again, calling him fragile, unsuited to the discipline required of law. Yet when I caught his eye, his hand twitched against the stem of his glass, betraying something less secure. The mathematician sat 2 seats away, his plate largely untouched. He seemed preoccupied with the pattern of the silverware, aligning knife and fork with the precision of a man arranging an equation. I asked him lightly whether he enjoyed the food. He looked up blankly as though I had spoken in code and muttered only that it was adequate. His gaze slid towards the lawfellow, and I detected in it not camaraderie but calculation. Crossed wires against men bound together by rivalry, not trust. The historian spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words carried weight. He mentioned bridges, not directly but obliquely, referring to them in the context of medieval trade routes. His voice was measured, but I could not ignore the echo of Finch's underlined stanza or the slip of paper I carried, still the bridge at dawn. He smiled faintly when I pressed him, as though amused that I would chase shadows. Yet the smile lingered too long, like a man enjoying his own secrecy. I noticed then a subtle choreography of glances. The law fellow watching the historian, the mathematician watching both, and the historian watching no one, his eyes instead fixed on the flicker of the candle as if rehearsing detachment. Finch had dined among them only nights before his absence, seated lower down the hall. Was it coincidence that these three men, so different in their disciplines, seemed bound together now by silence? A student from Balliol, invited as a guest, attempted a joke about the quality of the wine. The laughter it provoked was thin, obligatory, like paper tearing. But at that moment I observed something small. The historian raised his glass and set it down without drinking, the same gesture Finch had been reported to have made on his final night. A gesture of refusal or of hesitation? A detail easily overlooked, unless one had already been told of it. I filed it away. Midway through the meal, the talk turned, as it often does in Oxford, to puzzles. The law fellow recited a riddle, self-satisfied. The mathematician offered a paradox. I countered with a crossword clue delivered idly, as though part of the game. 9 across absence of truth, 3 letters. Lies, the law fellow said immediately, too quickly. Fib, offered the mathematician, tentative. The historian alone paused, his eyes lowered. He said nil, nothing. It was an unusual solution, but one that spoke volumes. To him, absence itself was a lie. The word lingered in the air, heavier than the Latin grace. Dessert arrived, though few touched it. The law fellow launched into a story of a trial he had attended, filled with drama, and the others listened with the polite disinterest of men who know they must endure one another. I watched their hands instead of their faces, the law fellows tapping again, the mathematicians fidgeting, the historian's stillness. The play was all in the gestures, not the dialogue. When at last the meal ended and the procession began, I lagged behind, as I often do. The hall emptied slowly, its silence returning like water filling a drained well. I found myself standing near Finch's old place, lower down, the wood worn by decades of anonymous scholars. On the bench, I noticed a faint scratch, almost invisible unless the light struck at the right angle. 3 letters carved crudely OF, the same initials I had seen on the bridge. A private mark, repeated. A man declaring his presence in places where presence is easily forgotten. As I left the hall, the air outside was sharp with the scent of rain-soaked stone. The quad lay still, lamps burning faintly, their halos trembling. I thought of Finch, seated among them that night, surrounded by men who spoke of puzzles while hiding their own, watched by portraits that had seen centuries of ambition and silence. He had lifted his glass, set it down untouched, and walked out. High table is supposed to confer permanence, to anchor men within the weight of tradition. But Finch had used it as a stage for departure. Among the gestures, the riddles, the withheld sips of wine, he had rehearsed absence. The men around him had seen it, perhaps recognized it, and chosen silence. And in their silence, I heard again the faint hum of crossed wires, sparking faintly in the dark. I walked back through the cloisters, the echoes of my footsteps answering themselves. Somewhere within those walls truth lingered, but like the Latin grace it had been recited too often to mean what it once did. Oxford preserves its rituals, but it forgets its people. Finch had understood that, perhaps too well. The danger in detective work is not in ignorance but in certainty that arrives too soon. Oxford, with its libraries and rituals, teaches one to prize answers, yet it is also a city of illusions, where shadows look like truths and truths vanish into smoke. That night I believed briefly that I had found the solution. It glittered with coherence, too neat, too final. Even then I should have known that neatness is the enemy of truth. The rain had passed, leaving the stones slick and shining beneath a brittle moon. I walked across the quad with the sense of carrying a conclusion in my pocket. The law fellow, his hand restless, his arguments rehearsed, had seemed too eager to distance himself from Finch. His disdain for him had been loud, almost performative, and the woman by the river had spoken of an older figure, deliberate in gait, who followed Finch on the night of his absence. Put together, the lines converged. The law fellow had motive envy, disdain, perhaps more. He had opportunity, the dinner, the walk after, and he had the personality for it, ambitious, controlled, yet frayed at the edges. A man who despises dreamers, who cannot tolerate ambiguity. Finch embodied all that he could not be. I thought of the gesture again, the tapping of his hand on the stem of his glass, a rhythm too rehearsed, as though his own nerves betrayed him. And then his crossword answer lies, too quick, too ready. Truth, for him, was always a courtroom battle, lies against statutes, clarity against confusion. Finch, with his poetry and half-finished thoughts, must have been intolerable to such a man. It seemed simple, too simple. I found myself pacing the cloisters, the arches, throwing shadows that bent and straightened with each swing of the lamp. I remembered something Finch had once copied out in the library, according to the historian, passages not for research but for himself, as though gathering fragments. That evening I carried my own fragments, gathered them like stones. The note, the bridge at dawn, the underlined stanza and bridges cross what water hides. The initials carved into the wood, repeated in the hall and on the bridge, tell her, lies, chaos, all of it when arranged, seemed to form a picture with the law fellow at its centre. So I followed the picture. I went to his rooms, found him seated at his desk, the smell of brandy faint in the air. He welcomed me with the courtesy of one who believes himself untouchable. He spoke again of Finch, careless, dismissive, certain that the young man had simply fled responsibility. He said men like Finch vanish often. That absence was a kind of indulgence. He spoke too much, with the energy of a man filling silence lest it expose him. And I thought, there is guilt. But then, as he poured himself another glass, I noticed something. A small square of paper used as a bookmark in the volume by his elbow. I asked to see it, and he hesitated only a moment before handing it over. A crossword, half completed. 6 across river in Oxford, 3 letters. He had written Isis, correct of course, but what drew my attention was what he had left undone. 10 down disappearance, 7 letters. He had not attempted it. His pen had hovered, leaving a faint dot. A lawyer, a man of language, of argument, and yet he left disappearance unwritten. I left him there, the glass untouched before him, his face carefully arranged. The picture that had seemed coherent now frayed. If he had followed Finch, as the woman said, why had she not recognized him clearly? Why had she only guessed at an older figure, slower in step? The law fellow was not yet 40, his stride brisk, impatient. Too young for her description, too restless for her memory. The false solution dissolved as easily as mist. Neatness, again, revealed its flaw. Oxford thrives on misdirection portraits that stare, bells that echo, clues that lead towards mirrors. I had been led into a symmetry that comforted rather than explained. I returned to the river, restless, and found the mist had returned too, curling low across the water. A boat drifted, empty, its rope trailing like an unasked question. The bridge stood silent, its stones slick with moisture, the initials faint beneath my hand. OF, I traced them with my finger, as though touch might grant me insight. Instead, it gave me only the cold bite of stone. I thought again of the phrase on the damp scrap, tell her. If the law fellow had been the guilty one, why leave behind such tenderness? Tell her. It was not the language of disdain, it was the language of affection, of unfinished confession. Someone else's voice, someone who saw Finch not as a nuisance, but as meaning. The lawfellow had no such sentiment. His crime, had it existed, would have been of contempt, not of love. The bells of Magdalene began their midnight toll, slow and resonant, rolling across the mist. I stood there until the last echo faded, feeling the weight of my mistake settle over me. I had wanted a solution, and so I had seized upon one, mistaking coherence for truth. Finch deserved better than that. Even in his absence, he resisted simplification. As I walked back through the cloisters, I thought of the crossword clue left unanswered. Disappearance, 7 letters. The word eluded me. Not vanish, not absence, not silence. Something else, waiting to be found. Perhaps the clue was not for the crossword at all, but for me. Perhaps Finch himself had left it unsolved, knowing that in Oxford the false solutions arrive first, bright and seductive, while the truth lingers in shadow, patient, unwilling to be hurried. The stones gleamed in the moonlight, and my footsteps echoed as if reminding me of their permanence. Men vanish, Oxford endures. But within that endurance are marks, scratches, initials, fragments that resist forgetting. And so I carried on, uneasy, my certainty dissolved, my search beginning again in earnest. It is curious how one comes to realize that an absence can be more eloquent than a presence. We are trained, all of us, to notice what is there. The lines of ink on the paper, the words spoken, the gestures performed. But Finch, if he taught me anything, reminded me that what matters most may be the silence, the hesitation, the page that wasn't there. The library again. I had returned because the echoes unsettled me, the way the shelves seemed to murmur in their own tongue. It was late afternoon, the light dim and already touched with evening. A few students lingered, heads bent, their pens scratching in rhythm. And there, at the far end, the historian sat, spectacles perched low, a volume open before him. He looked up briefly when I entered, then lowered his gaze, as though acknowledging me but choosing not to. I asked the librarian whether Finch had left any trace of what he had been reading that last day. He shook his head, impatient with my persistence. Still, he admitted that one of the volumes had been misshelved since then. He could not say which. He said these things happen often, but Oxford libraries are too meticulous for accident. Books vanish, yes, but only when guided. I asked which shelf had shown the gap. He hesitated before pointing. I found the section easily poetry again, bound in leather, darkened with age. I drew a volume at random and leafed through. Lines of verse flickered, like half-remembered dreams, none of them marked. Then another and another. At last I came to one that carried the faintest indentation, as though a page had been pressed hard with a pen. But there were no marks, only the impression of words written on paper that had once rested there. I angled it towards the light and traced the ghost lines with my finger. A single word emerged, dawn, and then another, harder to see witness. It was as though Finch had used the book as a desk, written his words on a sheet above it, and carried the sheet away. The impression remained, faint but insistent. The page itself was gone, the page that wasn't there. I closed the volume and carried its silence with me. When I left the library, the air had grown colder. The bells of the tower struck 5, and the sound seemed more hollow than usual. Across the quad I saw the mathematician, walking quickly, his arms laden with papers. He almost collided with me. His eyes darted, nervous, and he muttered an apology. I noticed that one of his sheets bore the title, Probability of Disappearance. It might have been academic work, but at that moment it felt like mockery. I asked him if Finch had ever written in his notebooks. He said yes, sometimes lines of verse in the margins. He dismissed them as distractions, yet his hands trembled as he said so, scattering his papers. Among them, I glimpsed a crossword. He had filled in some answers but left others blank. 11 across missing piece, 4 letters. He had written gap. The obvious answer, correct and yet inadequate. I thought of the absent page, of Finch's impressions pressed faintly into the book. Gap. Yes, but more than that loss. Proof. Nothing. Words that circled one another like shadows. Later that night I sat with the historian in his room. The fire burned low, the smell of smoke curling into the air. He spoke again of Finch, his voice soft, almost paternal. He said Finch was fascinated by how history remembers by forgetting. He said Finch once asked him whether a life could be preserved in fragments. I asked whether Finch had ever given him a page, a scrap of writing, something small. He looked at me then, sharply, as though I had touched too close. He said no, but his hand moved to the drawer of his desk and lingered there too long before pulling away. I left him with his drawer closed and his silence intact. Outside, the night was restless. A group of students hurried past, their voices rising, then falling like the rush of water. I followed the path towards the bridge again, compelled by repetition. The river was swollen, restless and dark. I leaned against the parapet and thought of Finch's initials carved there, of the underlined stanza, of the absent page. Absence, like water, resists grasping. The woman by the river appeared again, her figure emerging from mist as though she belonged to it. She asked if I had found anything. I told her only that Finch had left behind more than silence. She smiled faintly and said he was always leaving things unsaid, half-written. She said once he gave her a scrap of paper with only a line to be read later. She had lost it, or perhaps she had hidden it. She did not say, but her eyes shifted away as she spoke, and I knew she carried more than she revealed. I walked back slowly, the fog heavy against my coat, the stones damp and shining. In my pocket lay nothing tangible, and yet I felt the weight of that absent page as though it were a stone. Dawn. Witness. Words pressed into a book, then carried away. A confession, half-formed, half-hidden. The page that wasn't there spoke louder than any page that was. When I reached my rooms, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat with it untouched. I thought of the crossword again. Missing piece, 4 letters, gap. The mathematician's answer was not wrong, but it was too simple. The real answer lay elsewhere, not in the letters, but in the space between them. Finch had known that. He had lived in the space between. The fire sank low, and the silence of the room deepened until it seemed to hum. I could almost hear Finch's voice in it, quiet, unfinished. The dead are not the only ones who vanish. Perhaps what he left was not a page, but an instruction to look not at what is present, but at what is gone. The page that wasn't there. The witness is unnamed. The dawn is yet to come. I sat until the clock struck midnight, the echo long and hollow. Then I extinguished the lamp, leaving the room to its own shadows, and carried the absence with me into sleep. The cloisters at Magdalene by day are solemn enough, but at midnight they belong to another world entirely. The arches cast their shadows like ribs against the pale stone, and the silence is absolute except for the occasional stir of wind or the distant cry of some bird unsettled by darkness. I have walked them often, but that night, more than any other, the air seemed to tremble with withheld words. Oxford at midnight is not quiet, it is listening. I had been summoned there not by letter nor by call, but by instinct. Pieces had gathered, pages absent, words half-formed, gestures that betrayed more than speech. Something told me that if I wished to hear the truth or something close to it, it would not come in daylight, but in these corridors where sound carries and memory lingers. As I entered, the bells had just finished their slow declaration of the hour. Their echo clung to the stone, fading but not gone. I stood under the arch, my breath faint in the cold, and waited. And then, from the far end, a figure appeared. The historian, his gown thrown about his shoulders, a book under one arm. He greeted me with surprise that was too rehearsed to be genuine. He said he often walked the cloisters when sleep refused him. But his eyes flickered as he spoke, as though rehearsing not words, but evasions. We walked together for a time, our steps echoing in strange harmony. He spoke of Finch again, of how the boy had been restless, never content with half answers. He said Finch had asked once whether absence could be a form of presence. I asked him what he had answered. He smiled faintly and said nothing. Silence, as ever, was his most practised reply. At a corner of the cloisters where a lamp sputtered, I stopped and leaned against the wall. I asked him directly whether Finch had left him anything, a letter, a page, a word. He shook his head, but his hand once again drifted unconsciously towards his pocket before falling away. It was the same hesitation I had seen before at his desk, the hand that lingered too long above a drawer. A man can polish his sentences into lies, but his gestures remain untidy. Before he could answer further, another presence arrived. The mathematician, his steps quick, his papers clutched in a sheaf. He claimed he, too, could not sleep. He said he had been working on probabilities, on the mathematics of vanishing. He spoke with a kind of manic brightness, words tumbling out too quickly. He said it was simple, really you calculate the odds of each choice, each step, and disappearance becomes an equation. He laughed softly, but his laugh cracked in the still air. The historian regarded him with cool disdain, as though his logic were vulgar. He said Finch had no equation, no probability. He was a boy undone by poetry and by longing. The mathematician snapped back, saying, "Longing is only the mask men wear when they lack discipline." I listened, silent, as their words collided and fell, the cloisters swallowing them. And in that collision, I saw the truth. They were not speaking of Finch alone. They were speaking of themselves, their rivalries, their resentments, their unspoken envy of youth, unclaimed by their disciplines. Finch had walked among them like a mirror, reflecting all they wished to deny. A sound interrupted us then, a faint footstep, not our own, from the far end of the cloisters. We turned, but saw nothing but the play of shadow and lamp. The historian murmured that perhaps the cloisters are always walked by more than those we see. His words were meant as philosophy, but in that moment they felt like confession. We parted soon after, the mathematician retreating to his rooms, the historian disappearing into shadow. I lingered. It is in lingering that one notices the overlooked, a scrap of paper folded small, tucked beneath a stone bench. I drew it out carefully. The ink had run, blurred by damp, but the words could still be made out. "Tell her at midnight." The phrase struck me like a bell. Tell her the same words I had found by the river. But now it's midnight, and here I was at midnight in the cloisters, holding the instruction in my hand. Who was she? The woman by the river, with her brooch shaped like a key? Another, hidden still in the labyrinth of Oxford? Or was it merely a fragment meant to mislead, to confuse? I stood in the silence, the paper in my hand, the lamp sputtering above me. I thought of the crossword the porter had left unfinished earlier that day. 15 down Meeting Place, 5 letters. He had written Hall, but then crossed it out, leaving it blank. Meeting Place. The cloisters themselves were such a place where voices crossed, where lies met truths, where absence came to be noticed. The paper in my hand was proof enough of that. As the hour deepened, the mist crept into the arches, softening their lines. I felt suddenly the weight of Oxford centuries pressing upon me, each stone carrying its share of vanished names, unsolved absences. Finch was not the first to walk into mist, and he would not be the last. Yet the fragments he had left on the bridge, the verse, the initials, the absent page, the words, "Tell her," were different. They resisted silence. They asked to be heard. When I finally left the cloisters, the city lay hushed, the lamps dimmed, the air sharp with damp. I carried the paper with me, its words unfinished, ambiguous, like Finch himself. Midnight at the cloisters had not given me resolution, only another echo, but in Oxford, echoes matter. They are what remain when voices are gone. I walked slowly back to my rooms, the bells having ceased, the silence deep and watchful. And as I crossed the quad, I knew that somewhere, someone had spoken at midnight, and someone else had listened. The wires were still crossed, the page still missing, but the story was gathering towards its dawn. Latin has always struck me as a language designed for concealment. Its precision gives the illusion of clarity, yet the further one reads, the more it drapes itself in ambiguity. In Oxford, it lingers like dust upon stone, whispered in chapels, muttered at dinners, carved into lintels no one translates. That evening, in the cold hush of the chapel cloisters, I heard it spoken not as prayer, but as confession. I had gone there reluctantly, following a hunch no more solid than mist. A slip of paper had been left beneath my door, on signature, no address, only a phrase in faint ink, confessio. Latin struck me, not a plea, not an answer, but a declaration waiting to be spoken aloud. I knew the chapel would be the only place such a word might find its echo. Inside, the air was heavy with candle wax and old wood. The pews stood in silent rows, their cushions thin with use. I sat near the back, listening. The faintest shuffle of steps, the rustle of fabric, and then a voice. Low, deliberate, halting, the historian's voice. He was speaking to the empty nave or to the dead whose bones lay beneath the stones. The Latin rolled slowly, as if he translated his guilt into a language not his own. I made out fragments. Non omnes mortui sunt qui absunt. Not all are dead who are absent. The words echoed against the walls, settling like dust on the hymnals. He spoke again. Testis unus non sufficit. A single witness is not enough. His voice cracked then, as though the very act of speaking had betrayed him. I waited until silence thickened once more before I stepped forward. He turned, and the look on his face was not surprising but weariness. He said it was easier to speak in Latin. Words seemed less dangerous that way, less binding. He said Finch had come to him often, restless, bringing scraps of verse, fragments of thought. He had listened, sometimes with patience, sometimes with irritation, but always with attention. He admitted that Finch had left him a page, folded, pressed into his hand after hall one evening. He said he had not meant to keep it, but he could not destroy it either. It sat now in his drawer, a page that was there, though it might as well have not been. I asked him what the page said. He closed his eyes briefly, as though repeating it inwardly. Then he recited, not in English, but again in Latin, dic e ad pontem, "Tell her at the bridge." The same words I had found blurred by rain, the same echo whispered by the woman by the river. A message passed in fragments, never whole. He said he had not gone to the bridge, though he had considered it. He said Finch had asked him once whether a life could be preserved if someone bore witness to its vanishing. He had laughed it off, called it poetry. But Finch had not laughed. He had written his words instead, leaving them like crumbs. Tell her at the bridge. Witness. Dawn. Always the same refrain. As he spoke, his hands trembled against the pew. I noticed a slip of paper fall from his coat. I bent to retrieve it. It was not Finch's note, but a crossword, half-finished, scrawled in his faint hand. 14 across language of confession, 5 letters. He had written Latin, correct of course, but 2 on the nose. To be coincidence, it was as if even his puzzles conspired to betray him. I asked him directly whether Finch had died. He flinched, then whispered, "No." He said Finch had disappeared, yes, but not into death. He said he believed the boy had chosen absence, a deliberate vanishing staged like a play, rehearsed in the quad, performed at the bridge. He said he had not stopped him because he did not know how. His voice sank, and he murmured again in Latin, silentium loquitur. Silence speaks. I left him there, kneeling as though in prayer, though his words were not prayers but confessions, dressed in borrowed language. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping gently against the chapel glass. The cloisters glistened with damp, their stones reflecting the flicker of lamps. As I walked back, I thought of Finch, of the fragments he had left. Not all are dead who are absent. Tell her at the bridge, witness. Silence speaks, each a clue, each an evasion. Perhaps he had left Oxford not through violence, but through choice, slipping into absence with the deliberate artistry of a man who understood the power of not being seen. Or perhaps he had been helped, hindered, followed. Ambiguity clung as stubbornly as the rain. At my desk later, with the whiskey half-finished beside me, I looked, again at the words I had gathered. They did not resolve the truth, they refused to. Instead, they flickered like Latin phrases translated poorly, meaning shifting with each attempt. A confession in Latin is not absolution, it is camouflage. And Oxford thrives on camouflage. The clock struck midnight, its chime muffled by the storm outside. I sat in silence, listening. Silence speaks, he had said. And in that silence I almost heard Finch's footsteps still, circling the quad, rehearsing his departure, marking his presence in absence. The city held him still, though the page was missing, though the words were scattered. Oxford remembers, even when men vanish, especially then. The rain had returned by the time I left my room, steady and relentless, the sort of rain that made Oxford glisten like a city newly washed, yet still burdened by centuries of residue. I had walked these stones before under drizzle and mist, but that night it fell heavier, drumming against the cloisters, coursing down the gutters, hammering its patience into the pavements. Rain again on the stones, a circle completed, though I had not yet decided whether it was resolution or repetition. I went back to the bridge as though all paths ended there. The arches rose black against the swollen river, water churning below with the sound of muted applause. In my pocket were the fragments I had gathered, the blurred slip, the underlined stanza, the absent page, the confession in Latin. Each weighed little, yet together they burdened me like a verdict. I leaned on the parapet, fingers pressed against the damp stone, and thought of Finch. The initials he had carved were wet again, glistening, as though renewed by rain. Behind me, footsteps. I did not turn immediately. Oxford has a way of making footsteps sound multiplied, as though past and present walk together. It was the woman by the river. Her hair clung to her face in the rain, and the brooch, shaped like a key, glimmered faintly in the weak light. She said only that she had come because she had been told to. Tell her at the bridge. The words had found their place at last. I asked what Finch had told her. She hesitated, then said he had spoken of vanishing as a form of protest, of stepping out of the page so that others might read the margin. He said he was tired of being translated by others, tired of being judged by law or by mathematics, tired of being measured by history's indifferent scale. He wanted, she said, to write about his own absence. I asked her if he had succeeded. She looked at the river and said nothing. Silence speaks. From the mist, another figure emerged, the historian. His gown clung to him, heavy with rain. He admitted then in English this time that Finch had given him the page, had asked him to keep it safe. He said he had recited it in Latin because it was easier that way, because Latin held the weight of centuries and dulled the sting of confession. He said Finch had asked him to bear witness to ensure that his vanishing would not be mistaken for erasure. He confessed quietly that he had failed. He had not gone to the bridge at dawn. He had stayed behind in his rooms, afraid of what he might see. The woman turned on him, her voice sharp, even through the rain. She said Finch had trusted him. He lowered his eyes and replied that trust is rarely deserved. His hands shook as he wiped rain from his face, though his gesture revealed nothing more than weariness. A constable passed then, his lantern swinging, his gaze suspicious. He asked what we were doing there at such an hour. I said only that we were remembering. He frowned, but moved on, his light vanishing into the mist. The river swallowed his footsteps quickly. We stood in silence for some time, the three of us, each carrying a different version of Finch. To the woman he was a restless boy yearning for escape. To the historian he was a student who asked too much of history. To me he was absent itself, rehearsed and performed in fragments. I recalled then the crossword the porter had left unfinished earlier that evening. 22 down repeated sound, 4 letters. He had left it blank. Echo. The answer was obvious, and yet he had not written it. Finch too was an echo now, repeated in our voices, never whole, never final. The rain thickened. The woman pulled her coat tighter and said she would not return again. She touched the brooch at her collar and walked away into the fog, her figure dissolving as though absorbed by the stones. The historian lingered a moment longer, then followed, his steps slow, deliberate, guilty. I remained at the bridge, listening to the water and the rain, the city around me muted into one long sigh. Perhaps Finch had chosen absence, perhaps he had been guided towards it, perhaps both. Oxford thrives on ambiguities, and this was merely another, more personal. What remained were not solutions but fragments, words pressed into paper, gestures half seen, silence too deliberate to ignore. It was not enough for the law, not enough for certainty, but it was enough for Oxford, which remembers in whispers. When at last I turned back, the rain was still falling, steady and ceaseless, striking the stones with the rhythm of time itself. I walked through the quad, my coat heavy, my thoughts heavier. The lamplight flickered, blurred by rain, and the arches dripped steadily. Rain again on the stones, the beginning and the end. I reached my rooms, poured a measure of whiskey, and sat listening to the water against the glass. The city outside kept its silence. Within it, Finch's absence lingered like a question never asked, never answered. And in that silence I felt Oxford's heartbeat slow, stubborn, remembering, always remembering.